July 1942, North Africa. Dawn broke across the desert in streaks of amber and gold, the rising sun casting long shadows over RAF Abukir's dusty airfield. Flight Lieutenant James Winters squinted against the glare as he watched his Spitfire MKV being rolled from its sandbagged revetment. Another mission, another day of struggling to catch the elusive Messerschmitt Bf-109Fs that had been decimating his squadron. The young pilot's face was etched with fatigue as he approached his aircraft, his movements mechanical after weeks of combat. Behind him, Corporal David Harrington, a stocky ground mechanic with oil-stained hands and sharp eyes, watched with growing concern. The corporal had spent the previous 6 hours preparing this aircraft, just as he had done every night for months, but something was different today. His mind was churning with an idea that wouldn't let go. "Sir," Harrington called out, his voice carrying across the hardpan, "she'll give you all she's got, but it won't be enough up high." Winters paused at the wing root and nodded grimly. They both knew the truth. The Spitfire's performance at altitude had been severely compromised by the large, bulky Vokes tropical filter fitted beneath the nose. At ground level, the reduction in airspeed was manageable, but above 15,000 feet, where dogfights increasingly took place, the loss was critical. "Just keep her running, Corp," Winters replied, climbing into the cockpit. Harrington stepped back as the Merlin engine roared to life, its distinctive growl punctuated by the occasional splutter from the sand-clogged filter. Sand and performance were enemies here, but they couldn't have one without the other. As the Spitfire taxied away, Harrington's eyes narrowed, watching the dust kicked up by the propeller wash swirl into the massive filter box. There had to be a better way. 30 minutes later, the squadron returned one aircraft short. Flight Lieutenant Winters barely made it back, his Spitfire riddled with bullets, his voice tense as he described how they'd been bounced by 109s at 18,000 feet. "They came out of the sun," he reported to the intelligence officer. "We couldn't climb fast enough to challenge them. Evans never had a chance." From the edge of the group, Corporal Harrington listened, his hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just about engineering anymore. It was about survival. The problem had begun months earlier when the Spitfire MKVs were first deployed to North Africa. Designed for the green fields and moderate climate of England, the aircraft had required significant modification to cope with the punishing desert environment. Chief among these adaptations was the Vokes tropical filter, an enormous box fitted beneath the engine intake that prevented sand and dust from being sucked into the delicate Merlin engine. The Vokes filter was a mechanical paradox, essential for survival in the desert, yet detrimental to the aircraft's performance. Tests had shown that it reduced the Spitfire's maximum speed by nearly 30 miles per hour and significantly hindered its rate of climb. Against the German fighters, particularly the formidable Messerschmitt Bf-109F, with its fuel-injected DB601N engine, this performance gap was often the difference between victory and defeat. Throughout the spring of 1942, reports from frontline squadrons grew increasingly dire. The Spitfire MKV, which had proven so effective over the skies of Britain, was struggling in the desert theatre. The RAF pilots found themselves repeatedly outclimbed and outrun at higher altitudes. Squadron losses mounted. The 109 can outclimb us by about 1,000 feet per minute above 15,000 feet. Squadron leader Phillips explained during a briefing at 103 Maintenance Unit at Abukir. "We're sending these boys up there with one hand tied behind their backs." Corporal David Harrington, one of the few qualified engineer mechanics at the depot, had spent years tending to aircraft engines. Before the war, he had worked as a motorcycle racer and engineer, modifying intake systems for greater performance. As he stood at the back of the briefing room, listening to pilots describe how German fighters seemed to climb away like rockets, a memory stirred from his racing days. That night, after his shift ended, Harrington remained in the maintenance hangar, staring at a disassembled Vokes filter. The unit was built like a tank, heavy steel construction with complex baffling systems. It was designed by engineers who prioritized absolute filtration over everything else. But what if there was a compromise? What if they could retain most of the filtering capability while dramatically reducing the drag? By lamplight, with the desert wind howling outside the hangar doors, Harrington began sketching on the back of a maintenance log. His idea was considered so elementary, so obvious, that when he first shared it with fellow mechanics, they laughed. "That's too dumb to work," one said. If it were that simple, the factory boys would have done it already. But simplicity was exactly what Harrington was counting on. Harrington understood the engineering principles at play better than most of his peers. The Merlin engine in the Spitfire was a precision instrument, requiring clean air to function reliably. Desert operations presented a brutal equation: protect the engine from sand ingestion or maintain combat performance. The standard Vaux filter had firmly prioritized the former at the expense of the latter. Sitting at his workbench in the corner of the hangar, Harrington dismantled a spare filter unit, examining every component. The filtration element itself was sound, multiple layers of fine mesh, designed to trap particles as small as 5 microns. The problem lay in the housing, a rectangular box that disrupted the smooth airflow the Merlin's supercharger required for optimal performance. With calipers and ruler, he took precise measurements, calculating the minimum space needed to house an effective filter element. The numbers were promising. The standard Vaux housing was over-engineered by nearly 40%, with dead spaces that served no functional purpose but created significant drag. "What are you working on, Corp?" Flight Sergeant Miller asked, pausing as he passed by Harrington's bench. "Trying to make these kites climb again," Harrington replied, not looking up from his sketches. Miller leaned over, examining the detailed drawings. "Engineering approved this." "Not exactly," Harrington admitted. "More of a personal project." The flight sergeant's expression hardened. "You know the rules, Harrington. No unauthorized modifications." "I know, Sarge, but have you spoken to the pilots lately? The 109s are climbing away from them. They can't even get to the same altitude to engage." Miller's face softened slightly. He'd been at Abukir long enough to attend too many memorial services for pilots who never returned. Just sketches, right? No actual modifications to aircraft. Just sketches, for now. With Miller's tacit approval, or at least his deliberate oversight, Harrington expanded his project. He obtained performance data for the Spitfire, both with and without the tropical filter. The numbers confirmed what the pilots had reported. The standard Vaux filter reduced climb rate by approximately 500 feet per minute and top speed by 28 mph. At operational altitudes above 15,000 feet, the performance deficit increased exponentially due to the reduced air density. The challenge wasn't just aerodynamic, but structural. Any modified filter would need to mount securely to the existing attachment points while maintaining the proper airflow path to the carburetor. The design also needed to withstand the vibration of the 470 horsepower Merlin engine at full military power. After 3 weeks of nightly work, Harrington had refined his concept. His design reduced the filter housing volume by 42%, while retaining 93% of the filtration capacity. The new shape was gently curved to follow the contours of the Spitfire's nose, minimizing drag and turbulence. By switching from steel to aluminum salvaged from damaged aircraft, he'd reduced the weight by nearly 20 pounds, a significant saving that would directly improve climb performance. The final challenge was securing the materials and tools needed. Harrington carefully inventoried what he would require: aluminum sheet, rivets, sealant, specialized cutting and forming tools. Each item was methodically acquired through officially sanctioned channels, borrowing tools for routine maintenance, requisitioning materials for approved repairs. Nothing stolen, nothing that would appear irregular on the unit's inventory sheets. By early August, Harrington had everything he needed to transform his design from paper to reality. The time had come to move beyond sketches. Harrington's concept was born from observation rather than complex engineering. He had noticed that while the standard Vaux filter effectively kept sand out of the engine, its bulky rectangular shape created enormous drag and disrupted the airflow to the supercharger. His solution was to drastically reduce the size and reshape the filter housing to be more streamlined, while maintaining enough filtering capacity to protect the engine. The risk was substantial. If his modified filter allowed too much sand into the engine, it could cause catastrophic failure. Worse, unauthorized modifications to military aircraft were strictly forbidden, a court-martial offense under wartime regulations. But with pilots dying every week, Harrington decided the potential benefit outweighed the personal risk. Working at night over 3 weeks, Harrington carefully cut down a standard Vaux filter, removing nearly half its bulk. Using salvaged aluminum from a crashed Hurricane, he hammered out a more aerodynamic housing that curved gently around the underside of the engine cowling. The filter element itself was compressed and redesigned to maximize surface area while minimizing depth. Each step was performed with painstaking precision, the tools in his calloused hands moving with the delicacy of a surgeon's. "I'd like permission to test this, sir," Harrington finally said to Flight Lieutenant Morris, the engineering officer, presenting his modified filter. It was smaller, lighter, and distinctly more streamlined than the standard Vaux unit. Morris examined the modification skeptically. "You're proposing to replace a factory-specified component with this." He turned the filter in his hands. "Do you realize what happens if this fails?" "I do, sir," Harrington replied, "but I also know what's happening every day with the equipment we're currently using." Morris hesitated, then nodded slowly. "One test aircraft, and if anything goes wrong, this conversation never happened." The installation took place under cover of darkness on a Spitfire Mimc VB that had been grounded for minor repairs. Harrington worked meticulously, ensuring all connections were secure and sealed. When dawn broke, the modified aircraft, now 20 pounds lighter and with a noticeably cleaner profile, sat ready on the hard stand, its new filter barely visible beneath the streamlined cowling. Word spread quickly among the ground crews, who nicknamed it the Abukir filter, after the maintenance unit where it was created. Pilots, desperate for any advantage, began requesting the modification, but the ultimate test would come in combat. Flight Lieutenant Winters, who had lost his wingman the previous week, volunteered immediately. "If it works, we all use it," he said simply. "If it doesn't, it's on me alone." Harrington watched as Winters climbed into the cockpit, his stomach knotting with anxiety. Months of work, of careful calculation and testing, and the lives of pilots now rested on this moment, August 15th, 1942. The morning briefing was tense. Intelligence reported a formation of Junkers Ju-88 bombers, escorted by Bf-109s, approaching Allied positions near El Alamein. 2 squadrons of Spitfires were scrambled to intercept, including Flight Lieutenant Winters in his modified aircraft. The pilots raced to their planes, engines already warm from the pre-flight checks. Winters settled into his cockpit, hands moving instinctively over the controls. The familiar rumble of the Merlin engine vibrated through the airframe, but there was a difference, a smoother note, an eager response to throttle input that he hadn't felt since arriving in North Africa. "Bandits, bearing 270, Angels 18, came the radio call as the squadron climbed away from the airfield. Angels 18, 18,000 feet, precisely where the Spitfires had struggled most against the 109s. Winters advanced the throttle, eyes fixed on his rate of climb indicator. The needle swung further right than he'd seen in months. 3,200 feet per minute, 3,400, nearly 3,600 at one point. He found himself pulling ahead of the squadron, gaining altitude at a rate that matched the Spitfire's original specifications. At 15,000 feet, Where the climb rate would normally begin to fall off dramatically, the aircraft maintained its performance. The supercharger was receiving a fuller, cleaner flow of air through the redesigned intake. By the time they reached 18,000 feet, Winters was 1,000 feet above the rest of the formation. The enemy formation appeared ahead, 12 Ju-88 bombers in tight formation, escorted by 16 Bf-109Fs positioned above and to the flanks. Normally, the Spitfires would have to make their attack from below, vulnerable to the diving 109s. But today was different. Winters keyed his radio. "Blue section, follow me. We're going top cover." His section of 4 Spitfires continued to climb, passing through 20,000 feet and arcing toward the sun. The German pilots, accustomed to having the altitude advantage, didn't spot the British fighters until it was too late. Winters rolled into a steep dive, the sun at his back, lining up on the lead 109. The Messerschmitt pilot saw the threat and pulled into a climbing turn, his standard tactic for escaping Spitfires. But instead of watching the German fighter pull away, Winters found his Spitfire staying with the climb, even gaining slightly. 8 miles of sky became the stage for a swirling combat. The modified Spitfires remained competitive at altitudes where they had previously been outclassed. When the Germans attempted to disengage by climbing, they found the Spitfires doggedly pursuing rather than falling away. 17 minutes after initial contact, the remaining German aircraft broke off and retreated toward their bases. On the desert floor below, the wreckage of 3 Ju-88s and 4 Bf-109s smoldered in the sand. The RAF had lost 1 Spitfire, not from Winters' flight. As they returned to base, fuel gauges hovering near empty, Winters glanced back at the squadron flying in loose formation behind him. For the first time in months, they had dictated the terms of the engagement. The skies over North Africa had suddenly become more balanced. "I think your experiment worked, sir," Winters told Morris after landing, still breathing heavily from the adrenaline. Then he sought out Harrington, finding him waiting anxiously by the revetments. "Your modification just saved my life," Winters said simply, "and it's going to save a lot more." Harrington's hands were trembling as he began inspecting the engine. There was no sand infiltration. The filter had performed perfectly. Word of the successful engagement spread rapidly through RAF units in North Africa. Within days, pilots were lining up their aircraft at 103 MU to receive what was now officially called the Abukir filter. Harrington trained other mechanics in the modification process, working around the clock to meet demand. The results were immediately apparent in combat reports. Spitfire squadrons reported kill ratios improving by nearly 30%. Pilots described being able to meet the Bf-109s on equal terms at altitudes previously dominated by the Luftwaffe. By September 1942, every Spitfire in the theatre had been modified with the Abukir filter. Engineers from Supermarine eventually visited Abukir to examine the modification. Initially skeptical, they conducted their own tests and confirmed what the pilots already knew. The redesigned filter reduced drag significantly while maintaining engine protection. The weight reduction of 20 pounds further improved the Spitfire's climb performance. Instead of reprimanding Harrington for unauthorized modifications, they took detailed measurements and photographs to incorporate the design into production models. When the Spitfire Mech 9 began arriving in theatre in late 1942, it came equipped with a factory version of Harrington's design, now called the Vaux Aero V filter. Test results showed that with this filter installed, the Spitfire 9 could outclimb even the latest German fighters, reaching nearly 5,000 feet per minute in optimal conditions. Corporal David Harrington received little official recognition for his contribution. There was a brief mention in dispatches and a handshake from an air commodore who told him, "Good thinking," that military bureaucracy was reluctant to acknowledge that a ground crew mechanic had solved a problem that had confounded the finest aeronautical engineers in Britain. But among the pilots and ground crews of the Desert Air Force, Harrington's reputation was secure. His innovation had not only improved performance, but had directly saved lives. In the mess halls and maintenance hangars, his name became synonymous with the simple yet brilliant solutions that often emerge from frontline experience rather than drawing boards. After the war, Harrington returned to motorcycle engineering, eventually joining a racing team, where his talent for aerodynamic refinement continued to prove valuable. He rarely spoke of his wartime contribution, considering it simply part of his duty. The official maintenance history of the RAF's Middle East Command, filed in the Air Ministry archives after the war, contained one brief paragraph about the Abu Qir filter. Performance limitations of the Spitfire Mk5 in desert conditions were significantly mitigated by a field modification to the tropical air intake system, developed by maintenance personnel at 103 MU. This modification, subsequently adopted by the manufacturer, demonstrated the value of practical innovation in addressing operational challenges under combat conditions. In the decades that followed, air forces around the world would institutionalize the lesson learned at Abu Qir, that sometimes the most effective solutions come not from sophisticated engineering teams, but from the practical insights of those who work daily with the machinery of war. The Abu Qir filter stands as testament to how one person's simple idea, born of necessity and applied with skill, can tip the balance in the complex equation of air combat. As Flight Lieutenant Winters, later Group Captain Winters, would remark at a reunion in 1967, "The boffins gave us a magnificent aircraft in the Spitfire, but it took a mechanic with dirt under his fingernails to make it truly exceptional in the desert." Sometimes the simplest ideas are the most brilliant, and sometimes the most obvious solutions only become visible when you're losing.